You don't have to be a parent to know that planning for the future is important. Whether you're looking out for your partner, your loved ones, or just making sure your affairs are in order, having a solid financial plan, including life insurance, can give you peace of mind. Fabric by Gerber Life is term life insurance you can get done right from your couch, all online and on your schedule. You could be covered in under 10 minutes with no health exam required. Fabric offers flexible, high-quality policies that fit your budget, like $1 million in coverage for less than $1 a day. Fabric has partnered with Gerber Life, trusted by millions of families for over 50 years. There's no risk, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and you can cancel at any time. They have over 1,900 five-star reviews on Trustpilot with a rating of excellent. Fabric makes financial planning easier with free digital wills, access to investment accounts, and more, all managed from your phone. Join the thousands of people who trust Fabric to help secure their future. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/Kaitlyn. That's meetfabric.com/Kaitlyn. MEET fabric.com/Kaitlyn. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company. Not available in certain states. Prices subject to underwriting and health questions.
Welcome to Curiously Kaitlyn. This week, we are tackling maybe one of the most common questions kids and adults have when we start reading the Old Testament for the first time. We're humming along, reading wild stories about Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and the things they do might surprise or confuse us, but they still seem mostly like normal humans. And then, all of a sudden, we're reading the genealogies, those long lists of parents and their children. So-and-so begat so-and-so, and they begat so-and-so. And we're already bored and confused because what are these long lists of names even telling us? And then we read something like, Adam lived a total of 930 years and then he died. And we are lost. What is going on? Is this book that we are supposed to trust with our lives full of fairy tales? And if we're supposed to believe this, why don't humans live that long anymore? Today I am joined by Dr. Dominick Hernandez to answer this question. He will show us a few approaches to answering the question, but more than that, he will model for us two important ways to approach hard questions. One, with humility, knowing that we should not be dogmatic about what the Bible is not dogmatic about. And two, with faith, that God does wild and wonderful things that we do not understand.
I don't know. That doesn't make any sense.
Dr. Dominick Hernandez, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be on. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's hear our kid question today, which we've had for a while, and some people have kind of shied away from answering it. So I'm glad that you're willing to take it on for us today. Here's our kid question.
How do people like Adam and Seth live longer than how we live now?
Dr. Hernandez, what's just your initial reaction to hearing that question?
Well, that's a great question. It starts off like the Bible starts off by giving us the origins of humankind. And then all of a sudden we read like in like the 5th chapter, like page 3, that these people live to be hundreds of years. And we're like, oh, where does that come from? So I think it's a great question. It's a great observation from someone who reads their Bible, or at least has gotten to page 3.
Yeah. I love how many of these kid questions are perfectly logical responses to questions that people might ask. And I do think it's funny. Some of us tend to think, well, maybe people in the past read this and just thought, oh, of course, that's normal. But we forget that like for basically all of the time we have had scripture, people have gone, that's strange. I don't know anyone who's lived 800 years, 300 years. So what is your answer? Why did people like Adam and Seth live longer in the Bible? How is that possible?
Well, this is a tricky one because that's just not filler. The Bible doesn't exactly tell us how, right? Like I wish there were a book in the Bible at the very end that was the appendix and called Bible Problems, like Inspired Answers or something like that. But there is no sort of inspired book that resolves all of these issues, especially this type of issue that runs against our human experience. We've never experienced someone living to be 200 years old, let alone 969, like the oldest person in the Bible, right? So we just have to think about what are potential ways of working through what the text is saying, and not necessarily like, this is the dogmatic answer, because the Bible doesn't give us a dogmatic answer. And so as students of the Bible, we shouldn't be dogmatic about what the Bible's not dogmatic about, right? So I think there are a couple answers, and not all of these responses are created equal. But I think there's like two or three different ways to work through this. So some people would say, and by the way, I'm just putting these out there, and then we can talk more specifically about what I think might be the best or the better solution. So some students of the Bible, maybe like in the institutions that you and I attend or have attended, would say, look, you're reading this the wrong way. Genesis is not intended to be read like that type of literally. Now, that might rub some people the wrong way, but we're just talking about responses. And I said, not all responses are created equal. So just hear it out. Some people in our institutions would be like, hey, this book, Genesis, was ultimately compiled, probably at some point in the exile. And there were different people that put things together. The person that put this part together was probably the priestly writer. And you have to understand that in light of that, he was concerned about tracing a certain lineage, the priestly lineage.
When Dr. Hernandez talks about the priestly writer, he's talking about a specific theory for how the first 5 books of the Bible, sometimes called the Pentateuch, came to exist, a theory called the documentary hypothesis. Most biblical scholars agree that the first 5 books of the Bible were taken from oral traditions, spoken stories passed down through generations, then written by various authors and compiled together into one document. One version of the documentary hypothesis that was very popular for a long time is sometimes called JEDP. It's a shorthand for the 4 sources one scholar identified and other scholars modified and wrote about for a long time: the Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and priestly sources. Many biblical scholars today disagree with this particular form of the documentary hypothesis, but most still write and argue about what the various sources are and what parts of the Bible come from those sources. Dr. Hernandez is showing us what that looks like here. If this material comes from the priestly source, it helps us understand what the authors and compilers are trying to do with what they're saying. They're concerned with priestly matters of worship, the role of the priest, and the rituals of the people of God.
All right, so how does this speak to numbers? Like in Genesis chapter 5, where we have these really large numbers, right? And we have to recognize that if we come from this point of view, the Bible is great literature, and Genesis 5 comes right before Genesis 6. And we all know what Genesis 6 portrays. Genesis 6 through 9 portrays the great flood, right? So Genesis 6 through 9 portrays this flood. And if you look at the pre-flood ages in Genesis 6, and you compare them to the post-flood ages that we see in Genesis 11, the numbers in Genesis 6 are much higher, which seems to suggest something that the author might be getting across. And that is, people lived a long time before this flood. And then after the flood, they lived less time. So we're like, okay, what does that have to do with academic circles and the supposed priestly writer? And all right, now check this out. Lo and behold, in the ancient Near East, first of all, older generations were respected. So it's not uncommon to, even in the Bible, to hear people say things like, ask former generations and they will tell you. Job's friends do that type of thing. But also there was a king's list found in ancient Mesopotamia, which is like modern day Iraq. In the southern part, there was this land called Sumer, so southern Mesopotamia. And this king list tells the lives of kings from that area, okay? And this composition is frequently referred to as the Sumerian king list because it tells of the lives of kings in that area. It also tells of the lives, or also notes that kings lived a really long time, like tens of thousands of years prior to this flood. So it seems, for some people would say, it seems like there's something going on here in Genesis 5, especially where these numbers are really, really long, that sounds like something like the Sumerian king list, where that relates where the Bible is sort of relating some sort of story in its ancient Near Eastern context. And some would say something like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the first. That's what many people and academics would say. People in universities or some people in seminaries might go down that particular route. Now, others, unless of course you have any questions about that, I'll transition to the second view.
Well, I guess the only question I have is, from the people coming from this perspective would not say that those kings literally lived that long. They would say this is a way of communicating their importance, their value, and the Bible picks up on this trend that existed at the time and does something similar. Something
like that. Yeah. So the short answer is yes. What you just said is what some would say, and others would have their own interpretations, right? Because the Bible, ancient Near Eastern literature, if there's anything that we've learned out of studying like these ancient tablets that were pulled out of ancient Mesopotamia, if there's anything we've learned out of the study of those, it's that scholars really don't always agree on the interpretation of things that happen. Like we're talking like pre-biblical times, like Abrahamic times, right? Some stuff has been pulled from ancient Mesopotamia. So yes, what you just said would be how some would interpret the biblical text. Essentially, the Bible is doing something that we see in the ancient Near East. Look, we see it not only in this king's list, but we see that older generations are respected. If we can date wisdom to before the time of the flood, which we see in the Bible and ancient Near Eastern literature, other ancient Near Eastern compositions that were like written in this ancient language of Akkadian, different dialects, but like Akkadian tablets, cuneiform. Some of those compositions say wise people were really old. If you go back further and further before the flood, that's when you can see real sort of wisdom. So some would say that the Bible is doing something like that.
Yeah.
Now others would say that these numbers are symbolic. Okay, so this is a tricky one. Obviously, we're striving to, those that would say that the numbers are symbolic are still trying to reconcile the actual number with what we know about life. And that is people don't tend to live until they're hundreds of years old. So some would say, okay, maybe these numbers are sort of like a Bible code that we have to crack. Like maybe these aren't the numbers that we think that they might be. And some might say that they may relate to something like some sort of, let's say, astronomical period or something that we're not thinking of, that we don't default to thinking of in our day and age. Like these numbers they don't represent the numbers that we would look at them and interpret them to be. So that's another opinion. And the obviously an issue with that is that there may be, Kaitlyn, out there might be some sort of explanation that lots of people that believe that these numbers are symbolic agree on. But to be frank, it's sort of like a free-for-all, right? Like when you say, this is a code to crack, everybody's like, okay, I'll crack it my way. Divide everything by 3. No, divide everything by 7. No, divide everything by 8. And the problem with that was some would say something like that, right? I'm obviously speaking in sort of a hyperbolic manner, exaggerating a little bit. But the point is, some would say something like that, but what we end up doing is sort of imposing an outside standard on these numbers and saying, those numbers make better sense to me if I impose this standard because they become more like my reality. And just think, even once you start doing that, we have to deal with all types of cultural issues and life expectancy issues in different places of the world. And so, but again, we respect and we honor the fact that some people strive to relate these numbers to their actual human experience. Now, there's another option. But any other questions before we move on? Because I'm sort of just thinking through.
No, that's great. That's great. Tell us the next one. So
maybe another option. And by the way, this list is not comprehensive. We can think, maybe you and I can come up with another option together. What do you think?
I don't know. I'll leave that to you.
I don't know. You have. Yeah, I think we could. Two brains are better than one, right?
That's
we can come
true.
up with something really creative. Now, there's another option which suggests that the Genesis numbers are, look at me for a second, real numbers. Okay, now when I say real numbers, I don't know. I'm not really making a mathematical like statement. I'm not saying that there's a such thing as fake numbers. That's not where I'm going with this. What I mean is that the Genesis numbers are numbers like we understand them. From what I know, most people understand them in our day and age, from what I understand, most places in the world. They're like numbers and years like we would understand numbers and years in our day and age. All right. Now, here's the thing. Some people that are listening that might be like either in the first or second option would be like, oh my gosh, you're reading the Bible way too literally. And I'm kind of like, well, this is, again, not every opinion is created equal, but let's just talk about this. Some of this people that would understand these numbers to be real numbers, they don't deny the components of the previous views, right? So like the Bible, all of us have to admit that the Bible was and is an ancient Near Eastern document. Well, compilation of documents that should be understood in its literary and cultural context, among other contexts. So we can't deny that. We actually should understand the Bible in light of what we understand around the Bible. And so that's one thing. Also, the Sumerian king list exists, right? It wasn't made up. It didn't fall from, it wasn't tossed into ancient Mesopotamia to confuse contemporary Bible readers. It exists. And it does bear some similarities to the Genesis accounts that we see in Genesis 5, for example, and then Genesis 11, where the ages are they're pretty long then, but they're not as big and long as Genesis 5. But there's a couple of things. For those people that take these numbers as real numbers, we have to remember that genealogies in the Bible are never accidental, right? So I try to tell my students, and this is all of my students from Sunday school, the college and career group that my wife and I used to lead at my church, all the way through graduate students. And I tend to start off my exegesis classes by saying something like, friends, if we're going to read the Bible, we have to suppose that the writers of the Bible were smart. Yeah. They knew what they were doing, right?
Yes.
We can't suppose that the writers of the Bible were just maybe I'll just tell everybody's, it would be a good spot here to tell everybody how old these people were. That's not how they wrote.
Just on a whim.
Yeah. They wrote very intentionally. And wow, when we pay attention to some of the details, we realize, and this is why we read and reread, we realize that we miss things as we go through. And so we continue to read. Just brief example. Methuselah, who I made reference to earlier, lived to be 969 years old, right? Now, some people, what they would do just by adding up the years is they would say Methuselah, if he lived to be 969 years old, his actual number, 969, the actual number of the amount of years that he lived is put there intentionally because it seems like this number places his death during the year of the Great Flood. Now, you don't have to necessarily agree with that, but the point is there's something to how these numbers are placed and who is chosen to show up in the genealogies, right? All of this is intentional. There's intentionality here.
And now a word from our sponsor. Wait, what's a sponsor?
This episode of Curiously Kaitlyn is sponsored by Hiya Health. If you care about your kids learning better theology, you probably care about their health too. And typical children's vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full-body nourishment kids need with a yummy taste they love. Formulated with the help of nutritional experts, Hiya is pressed with a blend of 12 organic fruits and veggies, then supercharged with 15 essential vitamins and minerals, including vitamin D, B12, C, zinc, folate, and many others, to to help support immunity, energy, brain function, mood, concentration, teeth, bones, and more. Plus, it's non-GMO, vegan, dairy-free, allergy-free, gelatin-free, nut-free, and everything else you can imagine. Hiya is designed for kids 2 and up and sent straight to your door, so parents have one less thing to worry about. I don't have kids, but I have tasted Hiya vitamins and they taste great. Plus, they come in a cute reusable container kids can decorate with stickers. I also recommend checking out their new Kids Probiotic and Nighttime Essentials. We've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin, where you can receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/curiously. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/curiously and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. We all need help processing emotions, dealing with challenging situations, or working through conflict. But sometimes we need professional help. I've had a few times in my life where I saw a professional therapist to help process anxiety, work through pain in the church, or just get an emotional checkup. If you're thinking of starting therapy, BetterHelp can be a great place to start. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/curiously today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/curiously.
I'll give a better example if that's okay, about the intentionality here.
Yeah.
So the question related about, or if I remember properly, the question related to Adam and Seth, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great question, by the way. Now, the genealogy of Genesis 5, it traces the lineage of Adam through Seth. Now, you might be thinking, big deal. Like, what's the big deal, right? But why are you pointing that out? The text explicitly states that. Well, because Adam had an older son. The older son was named Cain. So why aren't we tracing the lineage through Cain? Cain had a wife, right? That's another question you may get. Like, where did Cain get his wife? Adam, his line is traced through Seth, and not his older living brother Cain. And this also demonstrates intentionality. So by saying the numbers are real numbers, it's not like, you just have people like, I'm going to be super duper literal, the Bible, exactly what it says to me. Like, that's not what we're saying by this type of sort of real number reading, but rather this view actually deals with the numbers, how we might understand them in our day and age. That's kind of more where this view goes. And I recognize some might not agree that this is the way to read this type of passage, or that we're maybe importing a contemporary concern on the biblical text, ancient documents. Like, are we doing that? Are we importing a contemporary concern? And we do that sometimes as readers, right? We import contemporary concerns, like what's on our mind now, and try to get something from the Bible to tell us about our contemporary concern where it might not be addressed. But also, we have to think maybe that we have to leave open the option that our contemporary concern might actually have been what the author was trying to get at.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of ways that some people that take these numbers literally suggest that they should be understood, or how this actually happened, right? Some people that take the numbers literally say that these numbers are literal numbers, they're real numbers, but they were calculated by utilizing some other numerical method than the one that we use. So like, we count based upon tens, maybe there was a method counted based upon twos. That kind of deals with a bit of an issue, but still, Methuselah lived to be 480 years or whatever. Like, that might be something like that. But we maybe we should ask these types of questions instead. Could it be that before the flood, could it be that people lived longer because the population was smaller and the toll of sin upon the world, the sickness and death that came in as a result of sin coming into the world, could it be that people lived longer because the results of this hadn't yet been fully realized? That's a common way of thinking through this particular literal understanding. It means basically that like sickness, the sickness that would lead to death would not have been introduced into, like many of the contemporary sicknesses that we deal with, would not have been yet introduced into the population. But as time went on, maybe people became more susceptible to those elements, the elements of living in an imperfect world, and there were more consequences of living in an imperfect world that were brought upon the people. So that says something maybe about the people. The people may have become more susceptible to some of the sicknesses and ultimately death that came upon human beings. The other thing has to deal, and it's similar, very similar, they're related, has to do with the earth. Like, was there some sort of cosmic change that happened? Was the earth in somehow, some way more, I guess we could say, suitable for people living longer lives at some point in the past? Now, I must admit, even these past three ways of viewing the text literally as real numbers, even those ways we can't be dogmatic about any of those because there's no book that says, by the way, this is how you're supposed to take the years in Genesis. But when I pick up my Hebrew Bible, it's my Hebrew Bible, it's really all jacked up, you see. It's not because I treat it poorly, it's because I've used it a lot, right?
Yeah.
When we pick up our Hebrew Bible, we're like, holy smokes, the text here says precisely what we would expect it to say if these numbers were to be understood, like we might say, literally, right? So, Vehi Adam shloshim u'me'at shana, and Adam lived 130 years. Like that's how you would say it in other places of the Bible if we were supposed to, if we were trying to understand what the text was saying literally, right? We would take those numbers literally elsewhere. So, even though this might seem a little old-fashioned, and it's not terribly creative, I still think that there's a good chance that, I can't be dogmatic about this, but I think there's a good chance that the text that I just read and other texts, I think that we're supposed to understand these, even as contemporary readers. You see all these disclaimers. I want to be kind and gentle because I understand that there's some difference here. And there's no section of the Bible that says you must agree with the Dr. Dom concerning this. But I do think that as we read these texts in context, the genealogies, the author is trying to set out something like, not an exclusively historical, but a historical account that's selective, it's intentional, but I do believe it to contain history.
Yeah. Oh, that is so helpful. Thank you for laying all of those out and for being so charitable in your description of them. That's like exactly the kind of posture we want to have. You just said something I think was really important. We just had Dr. Carmen Imes on to talk about where did all the other people come from if Cain and Abel are boys, and where is a wife for Cain? And she said something similar to what you just said of it's a selective account. It doesn't tell us everything. It doesn't answer every question. I love how you just said there's not a part in the back that says like, here's the inspired answer to these questions. I would love to hear you talk about, before we get into our last question we always ask, I would love to hear you talk about when people come to genealogies, some that have these really long ages, but some that don't, and they kind of just go like, this just seems so unnecessary. Let's just skip through it. Give us some encouragement for why, when we come to those, they matter. You gave us two really great examples of some like emphases that might be happening if we're paying attention, but how would you just counsel people who were like, this just seems so unnecessary?
Well, Kaitlyn, I must say to you that I wasn't expecting this question, and when you said it, my heart went, please no, like, and here's the reason why. No, and here's the reason why. Because I say my heart, like literally, my heart hurts when I hear these types of things.
Yeah.
And here's why. Because frequently within the context of the Christian church, whether you know this or not, in many of our seminaries or evangelical seminaries and churches in North America, we say or we act out what we call the verbal plenary inspiration of the scriptures.
Dr. Hernandez uses a technical phrase here that we might misunderstand. He said that we believe in the verbal plenary inspiration of Scripture. Let's break down these three words. Verbal doesn't mean that God spoke out loud the words of the Bible. It means we believe every word of the Bible was inspired by God. Plenary means full or complete. We believe all the words are equally authoritative, not some more inspired than others.
So we believe like the words are inspired by God, and not just the words, verbal, but like all of them, right? Now that's a larger discussion, and we could do something on that some other time if you'll have me back. But the point that I'm getting at is that many people that would say that they believe that all of the Bible is inspired really have a canon within a canon. And by the way, I want to include myself in that. You know, I'm part of sort of this like neo-reform circle that's like the Bible's inspired, but Romans and Galatians, they're really inspired, right? Yeah. And don't forget about Romans 9-11, because if you don't believe what I believe, so we have sort of like have this canon within a canon and even a canon within a canon. And I just want to be very open and honest here. I think it's a blind spot for many of us. But at least what we should do is recognize, bare minimum, right? Recognize that if we believe that the Bible, if we say something like the Bible is the Word of God, and we really believe that's the Bible, then we should read all of it as the very Word of God. So the red letters of Jesus, ready for this, aren't any more inspired than the chronologies or the books of or the book of Leviticus or Numbers. Now, it doesn't mean that there's an immediate and direct connection to the life of human beings in our day and age. Sometimes the connection, I view it like this. Sometimes when you read Paul in the New Testament, you can become the interlocutor. Like Paul speaks to the Romans, and you can put yourself like in the place of the Romans, right? Paul speaks to the Galatians, the books that you put yourself, because he's speaking to, in some cases, Paul's speaking to churches. He's speaking to people like you and I. They were different, but they still, right? People that believed fundamentally in who Jesus was and is. But it's very difficult to do that in Numbers. It's very difficult to do that in the chronologies, 9 chapters at the beginning of Chronicles. Like, whoa, skip. Okay, now we'll get to the story about David. It's going to be good now. But what I like to say when I teach things like hermeneutics and we get to these more difficult books is that we really have kind of a roller coaster approach here, right? So in terms of application, we might not be able to draw we might not be able to have the bow and arrow approach. The bow and arrow approach is like it's a direct line to the bullseye and it hits us right here. Like when Paul says, "Don't do this," we're like, "Okay, I won't do it," right? But when we read in Genesis, these are the generations of Adam, and these are the like chapters 5 and 11, we're like, it's more of a roller coaster. Ride the roller coaster. So we're doing this. And in the book of Numbers, we're doing this. But eventually, if we ride the roller coaster, we end up seeing that the end point, you needed to go through all of that ups and downs and some parts that were going slower than others in order to get to that end point where like, oh, wow, that was awesome. But if you jump to the end, you don't have any fun. And your understanding of what reading fun literature, which is severely, I guess we could say it's severely stunted. Like your growth as a reader becomes stunted. I will say one more small thing if this is okay, and that is sometimes skipping certain sections of the Bible. So you just mentioned the genealogies, but I'll throw in there like some of the Levitical laws, like Leviticus 21, 22, 23, or like, some of these other areas. Skipping some of those sections, I also think, especially in the Torah, have severe implications in how we understand God as God is presented in the New Testament. Because we frequently Christians will jump to the New Testament and understand sort of exclusively this depiction of God, and then we go back to the Old Testament. We're like, ooh, that God's like, we don't get a holistic view of how the Bible presents God, the multifaceted, the infinity faceted God that we love and serve, we get sort of very one-sided views if we only go to the areas that we think relate to our personal lives in this day and age.
That is so helpful. Thank you. I appreciate your passion for it too. That's very helpful. Dr. Hernandez, we always ask this question last. Imagine you are in front of a small child. I always like to imagine scholars being in the church. So imagine you're at church, there's a small child. You don't have the time or the ability to kind of lay out, here's all of the kind of views on this. How would you answer if you were teaching Sunday school or just seeing a child who comes in, they've heard you're the guy to ask about this in church. How did people like Adam and Seth live longer? What would your kind of short kid answer to them be?
First of all, there would be enough time to compliment that child on asking the question. Ask hard questions, children. It's okay. Job did it. Job asked hard questions. And God was like, you spoke rightly about me, but your friends didn't. They didn't ask the hard questions. So it's okay to ask these hard questions. I would, as developmentally appropriate as I possibly could, say something like the following. My friend, sometimes God does things that we don't understand and permits things to happen that we don't understand. When we go through the Bible, frequently things will pop up like a speaking donkey where we're kind of like, whoa, that doesn't line up with our experience. But we believe in a God that ultimately, literally pulled Jesus out of the tomb. A dead guy was like in the tomb. He was dead and he rose. So we can believe in a God that lets donkeys talk occasionally and created a world in which people were intended to live really, really long times. But as a result of how we as human beings have polluted that world, sometimes we don't always get the best of what was initially intended for humankind.
That is a fantastic answer. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Hernandez, for just taking this question really seriously with me today.
Of course. This was a pleasure. I love doing this type of stuff. So thank you for having me on.
There are lots of things I loved about this conversation. Dr. Hernandez's humility and thoughtfulness, his willingness to take different views seriously and charitably, and his reminder that we shouldn't discount a view or a particular interpretation of the Bible because it sounds unbelievable to us. Lots of Christians in recent years have discovered critical biblical scholarship, the research scholars have done to understand the origins of the biblical text. And that scholarship can give us such great gifts. But if we end up deciding that some parts of the Bible shouldn't be read in a more literal or historically accurate way, we should decide that because we think it's the most faithful reading of the Bible, the way that takes seriously the genre and the context, the way that seeks to discover what God wants to communicate with us. Not because we think that the literal reading is too weird or unbelievable. Some of us have started looking for biblical scholarship that explains away some of the weirdness of the Bible, trying to make this wild book into something more palatable for a modern, reasonable person. But we are people who believe a man was raised from the dead, and that we will be too. We should be prepared to believe wild things. Not just weird stories about talking snakes and 930-year-old men, but really wild things. Like the idea that the powerful will one day be brought down from their thrones, that the meek will inherit the earth, that we should give up everything we have for the sake of the kingdom of God, that there really is a good and gracious God who loves us and wants to spend eternity in relationship with us. Curiously Kaitlyn is a production of Holy Post Media. Produced by Mike Stralo. Editing by Seth Gorvet. Theme song by Phil Vischer. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a review so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus cute kids, and never any butt news.